Hey, Legal Rebels, this is Tom Martin. I'm the founder of LawDroid, and this is my podcast, LawDroid Manifesto, where I interview legal innovators about how they do what they do. In this episode, I interview Conor Malloy, the Director of Innovation for CARPLS, whose talent for using technology for good has helped thousands gain access to justice. Hey there, welcome to the LawDroid Manifesto podcast. I'm your host, Tom Martin, and I'm honored today to have as a guest Conor Malloy. He is the new Director of Innovation at CARPLS. And amongst other things, he's done Rentervention, and he's been a very big first mover out there with chatbots and getting them be very useful for people to get legal information and to actually take action. So I'm really excited. As you all may know, I love chatbots too. So I'm very excited to have Conor on the show. And with that, Conor, if you could introduce yourself, tell us what CARPLS means and a little bit about what you're up to now.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. CARPLS means a lot to me, and I'm assuming you mean what does the acronym stand for? CARPLS stands for Coordinated Advice and Referral Program for Legal Services. It's an acronym that came out of the early 90s when, once upon a time, some folks had this idea: let's deliver legal advice over a telephone hotline. And as you can imagine, back then, as you know, happens now with generative AI, some folks were like, "You're going to do what over the what?" And the sky was falling, and the regulators, were going nuts, and there was all sorts of doom and gloom ahead of us for that type of an innovation. But yeah, I'm still in this innovation space and loving every minute of it.
Yeah, loving to have you as a part of it. It sounds funny that the concerns that you're mentioning are ever present, it seems.
The establishment will never disappoint.
Yeah, consistency. It's sometimes. Yeah, so, I always like to start with my guests about your origin story and where you started. Where did you grow up, by the way?
I am originally a Clevelander. I grew up in Ohio. Yeah.
And what was that like? Was it, what side of Cleveland, like, what was your experience of it? Like,
Yeah.
school, early influences, that kind of thing.
So, for folks that are unfamiliar with Ohio, right? It's not like I was tending to the plowshare, every day, right? Yeah. West side of Cleveland, suburb called Lakewood. It was a great place to grow up in, and I'm sort of part of this generation, right? These geriatric millennials, right? We grew up as this digital age started to become ever more pervasive, and so my story is probably not incredibly unique, as we started to play with Ataris and going to the Aladdin's castles and stuff like that at the mall, and then logging on to BBSs and doing those types of things. So very early on, started getting very, very involved in computing and nerding out on that side. So that was probably a big influence. Growing up was that sort of space, and more so as like a means to an end, right? Like accessing information, accessing like people that you would have never interacted with, right? Ideas that you never would have really come across. It was a pretty radical thing.
It really was, and we take it for granted now. Like there were very, very isolated kind of islands of people, right? And when you were in it back then, I mean, you're about 10 years younger than me, but I really feel that we're part of a bridge generation where we really experienced what it was like in the before days, before there was interconnectedness like there is now. And it was truly a transformation that happened that Yeah, it's I think it's hard for younger people right now to imagine what that could possibly be like.
Things are cyclical, right? Like we still have that level of, like alienation from one another, right? Like it all still happens, on a social level. We still find ways to, separate ourselves. But it was just a different way of being, able to interact. Like you played games, you had messaging boards, with folks, like, it started to close the gap. You would interact with somebody that was in a different state, different county. It was just like a really really cool way to do things. And yeah, it was just really mind blowing the moment you heard that 2400 baud or 19.2 connection do its thing.
Yeah,
You knew the magic was about to happen.
for sure. Did you have any early experiences programming with computers?
I did a little bit early on. Like for like a BBS game, like I wrote like some scripts and stuff like that. And then early on, I did some programming, like some just real basic stuff, for like access databases. But never really got into it like on a real serious level. Again, I never really wanted to be like a CS major or anything else like that in college, um, because I couldn't just see myself doing that thing. I always just needed like a different framework to be involved in, um, where I would use sort of that programmatic thinking to advance something else. And that's where I took it.
Yeah, I mean, your new position as director of innovation, I mean, it's very like emblematic of a theme throughout your whole career is innovation and applying, technology to a problem set. And I'm curious, when you were growing up, was there an early influence of that? Where was it something like from maybe your mom or your dad or family members that inspired that, or is that something that was truly just part of your personality?
I grew up watching MacGyver. I don't know. Like it was just super cool. Like, seeing a guy like kind of cobble some stuff together was always, super neat. My dad was a tradesman, so that wasn't too far off, to be able to see, things of that nature. But really, it comes down to a lot of process. And so, for a long, long time, I worked in the restaurant industry. I was in the back of the house, and uh, just whether like working saute or whatever else, it all comes down to process. And like what's really cool when you're working in that capacity is it can be high volume, right? It is very fast paced. It cannot fail, right? Or if some process is not working right, you will quickly realize that that process is not working right, and you must quickly rectify it, and in real time. And you're always trying to streamline processes. That was always at the top of my mind to be able to do that. And so whether I was stacking dishes in a dish rack when I was first, washing dishes and optimizing, stacking dishes, and you think about it, you want to be able to pack a certain amount of things, or you're working on a line and you're putting your six pans in, so you can reach for a certain something because you get more of that dish that you cook so many times. All of that stuff comes into play, and every little movement, every little footstep that you make, plays a role on how many times you can get that dish out per night. When you're serving, 200-300 people, every second counts. And especially when you're working in a team, optimizing those processes is a big, big deal. And really, a lot of the lessons that I learned working back of the house are completely translatable to what I do on a day-to-day basis. When I was working as a solo practitioner, working with some partners, and then when I transitioned to legal aid, all of it was paramount.
Thank you so much for talking about that. I definitely wanted to ask you about your restaurant experience because I'm a big fan of the bear, right? So like
Oh,
that gives you insight as to like the whole dynamics and work ethic and precision and attention to detail and stuff. And I definitely see that overlap and how you could generalize out, how important the process is. And it's funny that, coincidentally, algorithms are so often described as recipes, right? Where you do step number one, then step number two, step number three, and that's how you like organize that way of thinking, algorithmic thinking. So I could see how that would definitely have an influence on what you're doing now.
Yeah, and things can be, replicable. And right, I had a chef one time, right? He told me, like I can teach a monkey to cook, right? But like, your last dish of the night has to look like the first dish. And so that product always has to look the same. And we're thinking about like, document assembly, or a conversational experience, and the information that something is dispensing, and having that reliability for certain things, right? That's the stuff that we're always trying to check, and we're always trying to cure, especially with some of the technologies that we're using now. That's always what I'm focusing on. And again, I never lose, I never lose that North Star that I picked up so long ago.
Yeah, I think that's really great. It also speaks to an issue that I think comes up a few times for me when I talk to lawyers, is that sometimes lawyers, myself included, like tend to think about things in terms of like you do this or you do that or you do this other thing, but they're kind of like separate. It's like either or propositions for these different practice areas, subject matters. And there's a lot that goes from, learning different different disciplines that actually complement each other. And that you could generalize from one thing like you did from working at the back of the house to like working as the director of innovation. Um, and so I want to talk a little bit more about that cross training because I was very curious when I saw the degrees that you have and like early on theology, ethics, and wanting to wrap my head around like how like what was your initial interest in that, and then after that like what kind of transition did you make from that towards the law and then innovation?
In retrospect, right? Like I always feel like I had a plan, because the big thing was I still remember I was taking a class at Loyola Chicago, and in my class in grad school, there were it was a Jesuit school, right? So there were some like baby Jesuits, right? Some people, some scholastics that were going on to become priests. You had some master's students, and you had some doctoral candidates, and I was taking a class on the Sermon on the Mount. I'm not going to sit here and proselytize or do any of that stuff, so no worries. But the professor stopped himself. Professor Shook, he was a fantastic guy. He stopped himself and he looked around the room because we were talking about some lofty stuff. We were getting on the Beatitudes, and he stopped himself and he looked around and he said, we're talking about some like really interesting concepts here. And he goes, I'm looking around the room, and a lot of you are going to go on and you're going to spill ink on this stuff, and you're going to advance our knowledge and really better our understanding of of this and unpack it for generations to come. And that's going to be fantastic. But at the end of the day, if what we're learning here does not feed the hungry, if it doesn't comfort the sick, if it doesn't shelter the homeless, then none of what I'm teaching you is really worth a damn. If what I'm teaching you does not find itself in the center of people's lives and the rubber is not hitting the road, then what are we really doing here? And mind you, like I was pursuing, theology from like an academic discipline, not like a pastoral sense, right? But I stopped myself and I was like, what am I doing with this? Like, is it that idea of like, publish, right? Go on to academia or perish, right? Or go to your local church, and so I thought, what sort of tool, what vehicle is so pervasive in people's lives, where I can take this sort of this component and find myself in people's lives in such a way where it has a meaning, where I can become, like counselor and have that sort of moral component, ethical component. And the law struck me, as sort of that vehicle to be able to for it. And that's when I thought I was going to go to law school. And it just kind of took from there. But yeah, that was sort of that was that epiphany of sorts.
Wow, it sounds like it truly was an epiphany.
He was a great teacher. Yeah, no, he was awesome.
Yeah. Um, brings back a lot of memories for me too. Like I went to a Capuchin Franciscan all boys Catholic school.
Mm.
So like the Jesuits were our cross town rivals, and yeah, I get the mentality and all that. I could see too that like from that influence, the idea to pursue the law was not just from a, obviously not just from a career making money standpoint, but from like a higher purpose standpoint about a way that you could amplify your impact to actually help people and change their lives.
Yeah, like, you know, in this, in sort of the same way where, like, I don't want to get all yeah. Uh,
Hey, bring it on, man. I'm a philosophy
yeah,
major.
sorry.
That's what I'll talk about.
Sorry. It gets all, because it is like very personal for me, but right, like, it's because, like, I feel like my work is my ministry in a lot of ways. And like, this from a lot of the work that you do, that, like, I'm sure, like, with your work, doing with like Leah for North Carolina, right? Like, for what like chatbots can do, and some of the stuff can do to, like, amplify access to, like, even legal information, right? Where you can, 10x, 100x, whatever, right? You and democratize this information. You can really, like, blow up the scale of things. And so by tapping into certain tool sets that we have available, and use the talents that we have, it can really do great work. There are attorneys that are in the trenches, right? I used to litigate, go to court, one-to-one client relationship, fight the good fight and everything else. And I found elements of that very, very fruitful. But then at some point, I just, I had to look at it and say there were certain things about it that, it just weren't fulfilling for me. And I had to be able to, expand on it and tap into certain parts of myself, that could, that could amplify that work, and really work with who I am and what I'm capable of. And that's where, like, a lot of the innovative spirit, came up, and being able to do the additional work with technology. So that's where some of that came into.
Well, it's a great place to start. I mean, having a motivation to pursue the career from a mission-based standpoint, right? Like where it really imbues it with a lot of meaning. I'm curious that when you did go to law school, when you Chicago, Kent, right?
Yeah, I started off at Valparaiso, in Indiana, and then I transferred, and I finished up at Chicago Kent. Chicago Kent was great.
So, okay, so when you're in law school, like how what's one thing that stands out as a way of kind of putting that together, of pursuing this like mission-based legal pursuit? Like, was there something that you did that brought that to a head?
For me, classes were classes. I wasn't one for classwork. It just didn't jive with me. It was the clinical experience, getting out there and doing the family law clinic at Chicago Kent. That's one of the big reasons why I wanted to go to Chicago Kent. Was they had a great clinical program, and especially I wanted to do family law. And there was just something that drew me into family law, especially, being a child of divorced parents, and, especially like a contentious divorce, and seeing that unravel, and what that can do to people. Uh, what I can do to potentially, be counselor, be helpful in those types of situations where people are in dire straits. So that's where I found myself, again, thinking about that law intersecting with people's lives. My goodness, how pervasive or invasive, right? Where the law just comes right into your living room, in family law. Yeah, when folks are at their most vulnerable. So um, that was the big one for me, and that's when I hung a shingle after I got licensed. I started practicing as a solo in family law.
And you're right. Like when people come to us, for some legal issues, it's extremely personal and very anxiety provoking and dramatic and all of that. Um, Obviously, dealing with corporations and all that it's not as high stakes, thankfully. But family law, I think is especially challenging, and that you chose that to really to make a difference is telling. That's fantastic. So you had your solo practice, and what happened with that? Did you go on to work at that point for legal aid, or how did that transition happen between private practice and then working at a legal aid organization?
Yeah, so I did family law for quite a while. Family law, it takes its toll on you, right? Like it's I remember reading an article. It was designed to be all provocative. It was in, like, I think, like ISBA, the Illinois State Bar Association magazine or something like that. I was talking about like sleeping with your clients, but it was like, like the fact that, like, you wake up in the middle of the night sometimes and you're like thinking about a case, right? And I would, like, I would be thinking about my, like, clients constantly, and and be drawn in to things, and it just wasn't good, for my well-being. And really, you got to take care of yourself first. And it was tough to continue that work. And and so I pivoted. I partnered up with four people, or three other people, when I was still doing family law. And then we kind of splintered, and I partnered up with one other person who was another partner. And we were kind of figuring out what to do. And he was in the housing law space. He was doing landlord tenant, but from the tenant side. And I thought, like, well, that's interesting, but what about landlords, right? What about, like, like housing providers, as they commonly want to be called? And he said, that could be something, but a lot of them are represented, right? Like they're big corporations, whatever else. And I thought, well, let's see, because I had a long practice where I would scrape court data and solicit self-represented litigants in, like, parentage court and whatever else, because, right, you got to be a scrappy solo and stuff. My kids used to, like, stuff envelopes and help me mail things out. And yeah, and so I kind of pointed my scraper to the housing court stuff, and I found out that 1 in 5 eviction cases in the greater Chicago area was brought by a self-represented landlord. I thought, oh, that's a pretty serious market segment, right? So we started targeting those folks, because it was like a lot of mom and pop operations. Like, a lot of them were like either first generation Americans, whatever else, come to the country, buy into the American dream, try to own real property, whatever else, and find themselves needing assistance with the legal components of an eviction, and need a lot of help with it. And so those are the folks that we helped a lot of times, were these mom and pop operation landlords that are kind of dwindling in Chicago as they get taken over by these larger property management groups. And yeah, we did that for quite some time, and that's where we, like, really started to kick up like a volume practice with just 2 attorneys. And, like, that was really fun to think about how to like I say that as like really fun, right? We're evicting people, and that's problematic in and of itself. But like from like an operational standpoint on how we were doing things to be cost effective for these clients because they were already hurting, they weren't getting paid rent or whatever else. They had significant costs because if they weren't getting paid rent, they weren't like paying, you know, for groceries and stuff like that sometimes. So we did a lot of like cool innovations to be able to to make that firm very, very lean and very, very efficient.
When was that? When did you start that firm where you're using data to dig up potential new clients?
So for my solo practice, I was doing that in like 2013 to 2015, and then beyond. For the landlord stuff, I was doing that like 2016 to 2018.
So, for lawyers that may be watching or listening to this, like, just keep in mind, like, technology is not just about, an AI co-pilot and, helping you draft stuff. There's also innovative ways that you can use it to get, new clients. And that's an ingenious way of finding just that market opportunity by looking at the publicly available data and identifying that segment. That makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of, analysis you could do like that pretty easily with Google Analytics and just see like what ads, who's spending what on what. And I get the operational efficiency part. That's, when you put in little changes and they have huge impacts, it's exciting. So was it from that experience that there came an opportunity to work in legal aid?
Like I've been doing stuff in the housing space for a while. I didn't know a lick about family or housing law, until my partner John, taught me, like pretty much everything I know, about housing law. And then, I was doing a lot with technology at the time, and I'd been doing a lot with technology, uh, and then, this thing, Rentervention, was going through this pilot phase and through the Lawyers Trust Fund, and they needed to be able to move it into production. And that's when I was like one of the candidates to be able to take it across the line. And yeah, and that was a pretty pivotal moment, was getting introduced to Rennie and working with that. And so and then making
Rennie, by the way, is the name of the chatbot, right?
yeah, Rennie, the Rentervention chatbot. So that it was, like, and it went through some significant, evolution, right? Like it started out, it was like this deterministic thing, right? Are you going through eviction? Yes, no, and there was, and it was like super promising, right? Like how do you scale up, without staffing up, because that's the traditional model, especially in legal aid, or even in law a lot of times, right? Like, well, how are you going to do more of this? We're just going to throw bodies at it, right? And that's not necessarily efficient, because you just throw bodies at it. You're not necessarily improving processes. Then you need like a supervisor for those bodies, and you're just kind of doing the same thing over and over again that they've always been doing. And this was looking at it differently to be able to say like, okay, let's kind of like look at the service model itself, not like being an informational website, kind of being interactive to a degree, being able to escalate things at particular junctures. So there was a lot of thought that went into this.
I want to dive into that and get into some more detail, but before we do that, I just want to
Sure.
acknowledge that they're very lucky to get you at that time, because just from what we've already talked about and what I know about you, the fact that all of these different experiences and expertise that you had at that moment were coming together to exactly be able to execute against what they needed you to help them with, that was extremely good fit.
Yeah, yeah, and what was cool about it too is like they wanted somebody also with like this entrepreneurial spirit, right? And one of the things early on in my practice is the Chicago Bar Foundation had this thing called the Justice Entrepreneurs Project, and it was this idea like creating a legal incubator. Like how can you create like these like socially conscious law practices, right? That are doing like flat rates or kind of like other billing type of regimens, and and using technology to a certain degree to be able to do it. And so I was already something of a known quantity, to some of the folks that were in this space. And they had sort of watched me evolve over time, and it was great to be known to them, to be able to enter into this. So I think it was a great confluence, on both sides for sure.
So getting into a little more detail about Rentervention and Rennie, you had mentioned that when you first, you know, so it was pre-existing in that it was a deterministic chatbot when you got there, or is it?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it had a certain tech stack that got built out. Originally they had worked with in Nicole Braddock's team, like did a great job, like building it out, like build out this like virtual clinic element to it. She sort of spun out the virtual clinic into its own product now.
Yeah.
It's a real pretty product, and built out the chatbot in its own tech stack. And it was just kind of, and it was there, and it was like, okay, Connor, like we need somebody to sort of fit in this position, to be able to do, X, Y, and Z. And, here's what we're looking at. But it was a little bit tricky for the overall mission statement, because one of the things that's crucial, and, this from the product that you have, is this idea of replicability. It's great to have a solution, but how do you get that solution from point A to point B? If some jurisdiction over here is like, ooh, we'd really like that over here, to be able to transpose that. It didn't really have a strong version of that. So that's one of the things that I worked on very early on, was kind of recreating it in sort of like a WYSIWYG, like very similar to like a law droid. I just didn't know about all y'all at the time. So like I had a thing that I'd used at the time, a product that I used, and it was just a WYSIWYG thing. And I was like, this is, it's in my toolbox. I'm just going to use this. And I rebuilt it. It seemed to work just fine. And that was sort of like the first step in the journey where I'm like, okay, now we can sort of begin to evolve this.
So it started as a deterministic thing, which, by the way, like it wasn't just until like 2-3 years ago that it was possible to have a more robust approach to these, chatbot conversational UIs. But even, I would point out that even with the rule-based stuff, like it accomplished quite a bit. So the thing though is that when you deal with most people, of course, there's going to be areas where there isn't a fit, and so that it tends to be too brittle. It'll break. Like it can't anticipate certain things. So definitely, like you taking it to the next level would definitely widen the people that you can help with that. So if you don't mind sharing, like what are a couple of the things that you did to do that, like to make it more accessible to people?
So one of the things that I did early on was just the introduction of some natural language processing. Originally, it was like, what are you dealing with? Like eviction, security deposit, conditions, whatever, right? And, you can only word things so many different ways. It's very difficult to like, to put things in some wording that somebody will identify as the issue that they're experiencing. And then you have like at the end, you just have other, right? And we would get a lot of others, and then and then you would give somebody like a free form text, and they would just sort of fizzle out into the ether, to be able to say thanks for that information. We'll try to update our system for it. Well, then I took that and I ended up creating like a pass through into an NLP system that I created as a catch-all. And then once the natural language processing was like, ooh, did you mean, it seems like you might be dealing with an eviction issue. An eviction issue is when somebody's dealing with blah, blah, blah. Do you think that's what you meant? And somebody like, oh yeah, I think that's what I meant. Well, now it took them on that flow. So they might not have identified eviction, right? They might be like, my landlord, wants to kick me out, and so, they skipped it, but then it brought them back into the flow through however they self-identified. And so I let it do that a bunch of times, and I let it learn from that. And then I eventually flipped the script where I got rid of that menu, and I put the natural language free form at the front end and just let people do that. And that's when, like that, I think that's when like it really started to get awesome, was just like, it was sort of like Google just putting that box up, right? Just making the interface super simple and just being like, why don't you just tell me what you're dealing with? Rather than getting somebody to silo it in there. Like I sort of compare it to like, remember, like dealing with AOL back in the day, right? Like versus a Google search. Like AOL, remember, like you used to have to filter stuff. They give you like 8 menu options, be like arts and lifestyle, sports and fitness, and you'd have to like keep clicking in this deterministic way, and then be like, oh wait, no, surfing isn't this, surfing's this, and you'd go back up the tree. That was always the problem, was like somebody else curated that information on that decision tree, and it didn't necessarily jive with how you understood it. But yeah, once I flipped the script on that, and then the generative AI stuff came in, oh, it was like a match made in heaven.
And I could see how that like easily applies across like all legal aid organization information, because they have their websites, they have lots of different pages, which, granted, they've spent, decades sometimes, curating that information, creating it, and it's really good stuff. But when it comes to people, regular people, trying to find that information so they can help themselves, it could be a little dense. They go down one way, which might be a dead end, like you suggested. Like this is a way to just like cut through all of that and make it easily digestible and intelligible.
Yeah. Oh man, like I have dreams about this stuff, because this is all I'm doing now, is thinking about knowledge. Like speaking of our, joint philosophical backgrounds, like sort of like epistemology is now my life. So it's really interesting, being able to think about, like, especially at CARPLS, right? We have this knowledge management system inside of our Salesforce platform that we use for our hotline, and we're going to be thinking about like a new knowledge management system and how to be able to do an internal facing, external facing, how to better serve our attorneys and how to serve the public and whatever. And it's going to be an incredible undertaking. But I think the finished product has, the promise is overwhelming. When I start to think about what some of the promises are.
Well, that's a good teaser. I want to get into I want to get into CARPLS next, but I do want to acknowledge for everyone that, Rentervention it has had a great impact. It's award-winning. It's a great accomplishment. And can you share like one thing in terms of its impact that it's had?
I just like the idea, that somebody can come there, like 24 hours a day, right? And and share with Rennie the issue that they're dealing with, right? And at least get an open ear on what they're experiencing, and begin to better understand the legal issue, and begin to open that door to knowledge and human help, right? So and in like a conversational platform, like. I think we talked about this a while ago, right? I still believe, that the future is conversational, at the end of the day. I don't know what it looks like in a conversational capacity, but, like I believe people love interacting with things like this. It sort of mimics that attorney-client relationship in some way, even though Rennie's not an attorney, yada, 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 UPL.
We know. The disclaimer and disclosure accepted. Okay, so CARPLS, like you just moved over to CARPLS a month ago, was it? Or
Yeah.
yeah. All right, and so in your capacity as director of innovation, what is that charge?
Yeah. it's looking at, a legal aid organization that's been around for 30 years and has had an incredible impact, on the greater Chicago area, and has done like a million, literally a million consultations with people, and honoring that legacy, right? And then helping determine what the next 30 years is going to look like, right? With the technology that's available, and augmenting what our staff is going to do, and especially, how the public is going to continue to interact with legal assistance. So it's pretty broad in scale, but for right now, it's really, what it's really turned into is focusing on knowledge management. That is a huge one.
So, okay, so for me to wrap my mind around it, it helps me to think of like before and afters, right? So like the before picture right now is that is it volunteer attorneys that answer phone calls and they give advice after their
Staff attorneys.
staff attorneys? Okay. So the staff attorneys and millions of phone calls they've provided like millions of consults at this point.
Like in the last 30 years, over a million. Yeah, they
Wow.
like last year it was like, I think north of 90,000, somewhere around there.
So how many attorneys are on the staff to give advice?
I want to say there's about like 45 attorneys and maybe about a dozen paralegals.
So I've heard this issue at other legal aid organizations. Is it the same at CARPLS that there's still people being left on the table that they don't get to give advice to just because they don't have enough bandwidth to reach out to everyone? Or
Yeah. Not exempt. Yep.
okay. So then, yeah, I mean, great opportunity in terms of like not only helping the people that you can actually talk to, but all those that you don't get a chance to talk to that just because there's not enough bodies to throw at the problem that
Yeah.
go without. So, okay, so the before is literally phone calls coming in. There's some probably triage for qualification of some kind or no?
Yeah, because right, like you're doing a substantive, legal advice, right? So there's a conflict check, and then some, very minimal barriers as far as income, and just collecting some bare minimum demographic information. But yeah, and then you get right on into it.
Okay. So then they get filtered down to the attorneys that, and they're only human. They're like they're 9 to 5, right? Or are the
Yeah,
hours longer than that?
not 9 to 5.
Okay. So then just there's obviously a bottleneck when people, they just got arrested. It's like 8 o'clock or whatever, and they just need to get some advice so that they can be quiet and not not say anything. Um,
Mm,
okay, so I get the before picture now, and so I'd imagine there's multiple opportunities to use technology here. Like one is on the intake where you could do some triage using something like running technology where it's using natural language to understand people's stories, kind of categorize them into different uh, practice areas and topics, and even likely, sorry, I'm just kind of brainstorming here that
oh yeah.
but likely after that, there's a lot of like preliminary, not advice, but information that you could provide about all of that good stuff that's been identified, and maybe lessen the burden on the staff attorneys that exist, so that perhaps that percentage of people that didn't get callbacks that qualified for them, that there'll be more capacity, right, to be able to reach out like that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. And then you're also looking at things too where you think about, like I once upon a time I developed like a practice management tool for like a physical therapy practice, right? And in a physical therapy practice, right, like and medical alone, like you track outcomes, especially like, yeah, Canada's not exempt from this, but definitely in America, right? Like you track outcomes like crazy because insurance companies, when you have third party payers, they want to make sure they're getting banged for their buck, and so you have you do an evaluation on some level where you have subjective, objective, assessment, and procedure, and so when you're doing that evaluation on the phone and you're collecting that subjective information, and there's some level of objective information, right? We as attorneys need to collect the, the who's and the what's and the where's and filter them in and be able to, collect salient facts to be able to apply the law. Then when you're doing, the, the procedure that you're giving out, right? So in the physical therapy practice, right, when I've determined that you have a limited range of motion on your arm, and we're doing some, osteopathic manipulation inside the office and stuff like that, we're not just going to do stuff in the office. We're not just going to do stuff on the hotline. I have to be able to send you on your way and do stuff on your own, right? You got to do some exercises at home. And so you have a treatment plan that you got to go through. And we got to talk about the effectiveness when you come back to the office. So when you come back to the office, we're going to talk about range of motion and pain and this and that. And so, for CARPLS, when we send somebody out into the world to go do something, we got to be able to do follow-ups with people, and we got to be able to do that at scale, to be able to see, to some degree, in a very altruistic sense, like, hey, how you doing, bud? Like, how'd that go? But also, if we had something in our knowledge base that said, but this was the proper course of action for this particular circumstances, and we're prescribing this to people, is this worth a damn in the real world? Right? Or does this need to be tweaked, or does this just be thrown out? Should we go back to the drawing board on this one? So what does this look like? And so, that's an important piece of the puzzle, to be able to, do these assessments as we follow up with people and bring that back into the fold, and maybe even some machine learning to be able to assess those things at scale to really see if that stuff's working. Then there's a possibility that if you can streamline that whole process from A to Z, right, that if you have a discrete fact pattern and otherwise, you can deflect that. Like, not to say that you take the human on the loop and entirely, right? If somebody ever wants a human, you get a human, right? But you could potentially deflect that whole interaction at some point where, like, by goodness, that this is what that person needs, right? We as attorneys sometimes know when somebody comes in the office that somebody's experiencing a certain type of issue. You already know what they need, right? You know what the objective is, in some instances, right? You can just write in the prescription and send them on their way, so there might be a potential here. The other thing is, in these types of situations, is when you start growing this massive data and you start seeing the interconnectedness to these parts, is being able to work upstream, right? When you see this person being able to that's working on this issue and experiencing this type of thing, maybe they're dealing with this housing issue. Maybe you see certain people dealing with this housing issue and this type of demographic or otherwise, because you're collecting this demographic information and these other things. Well, how do you send them preventative information to be able to deal with certain types of issues, right? So that you can work upstream. And so you can prevent that call to even come in to begin with. So those are the types of things that I'm concerned with as well, where you can provide that, like, tailored, narrow information to get ahead of it to begin with. So, yeah, because, like, once you have them in that, attorney-client relationship to begin with, that's where Rentervention has that level of anonymity to begin with, and it could never really grasp that, right? And there's a plus to that, right? Having that anonymity. But for CARPLS, where you've already brought that human into the loop and you've already established, a lot of information about somebody. Well, now that you have that, why the hell wouldn't you leverage that to its maximum capacity?
Wow. I mean, I could see now how exciting and what a large opportunity this is, for you, because on the one hand, like, just exploding, like, the topic from, like, Rentervention from landlord tenant to exploding that to everything, right? On the one hand, and then secondly, having that longitudinal relationship with a client where you see not just this particular interaction, but you see the length of all of their interactions, also, like, whether or not the advice or information that's given has an impact at all. And just a little insider baseball that, that information, that feedback you get is like back propagation. You calculate the loss to see what the differential is between what you hope to, how you hope to improve people's lives, and how you're actually affecting their lives, figuring out that difference, and then, course correcting to make it perfect. Um,
Yeah.
it's really great stuff.
No, and right, and like it could really just go like every which way from there, right? And like, and so with some of the efficiencies as well, like the things that you were discussing at the beginning, like all that and then some, right? So like if because if you can like because everything becomes at scale, right? Like if you can decrease a call by slimming down a knowledge base article and making them more navigable, and you take 10 seconds off of a call, right? Multiply that times 90,000, right? Like now you're taking more calls and you're doing other things, now you can potentially say, well, all right, like, huh, this is some of this is my personal thinking on this as well, but like now you start looking at legal deserts in Illinois and say, huh, why aren't we serving so and so county, Illinois, right? And north, south, and everywhere in between. And there's a lot of places that could benefit from a legal aid hotline as such. So there's a lot of things that can be done, and you could achieve like a gigantic scale, um, with just the tiniest of tweaks. Maybe it's quite a bit of blue sky, but yeah, I think it's all feasible.
I think it also points to this kind of future conception of legal aid, but also like legal services, that where we're going, yes, it is an unknown, but one of the big things that is a benefit of using generative AI and these systems that can take in so much data and find common patterns amongst them is that all too often in the before picture, we're too busy with the crush of business to be able to have the space or being able to step back from things to see these patterns. We're too busy, right? Like that's what you hear from every lawyer that's out there practicing, is they're too busy to deal with stuff like this.
Yep.
But having these tools allows us to get that perspective. And it sounds like, from the concept that you're developing there and putting into practice, is that by getting that distance, by getting that perspective, you could actually have a much better and more effective impact on people's lives.
Yeah. Yeah. And you can be right there, you can kind of be right there with them at all times, and just kind of be their buddy, right? And fold people, sort of the idea of Rentervention, right? To have those sort of discrete interventions, in people's lives when necessary. And so, to call the hotline and get that attorney help or get that paralegal help, right? Versus just calling the hotline and wanting to learn about your rights, and that happens a lot of times. People walk into a lawyer's office or something and just want to learn about their rights, right? Without having that proper, like telos, like to where, you like versus that so what, like, okay, here are your rights and a nickel, go get a cup of coffee, right? Like if you can have that objective lined up and have that attorney be able to have a discrete deliverable, right? Or have something that is even available for a paralegal to deliver on, everybody's practicing at the top of their game, right? The technology tool is doing what it's doing at the top of its game. It's delivering legal information, doing whatever else it's doing at a tailored level. The paralegal could be delivering work product, within the confines of whatever the treatment plan was that the attorney carved out. The attorney is altering the treatment plan or doing other things, to be able to craft, more advanced treatment plans down the line. Or catching things in a more advanced way and looking at the things in a more critical fashion on what's around the corner for this person or people of this category. I think it has the opportunity to really transform the way we look, at people's legal issues. And like we always hear about, right, like the gate at the top of the cliff, and do we put resources up here or down there? It's an artificial construct to be able to say that we don't have resources to be able to put at the top and the bottom, right? I think the AI stuff blows all this stuff up, like, and just says that we don't have it at this point. So yeah, I don't think that dichotomy exists anymore.
It's fascinating. I completely agree with you. I think that there's so much opportunity now that what you've described is a much more concrete way of looking at it that I think we can really take advantage of. A lot of people talk about, well, AI frees up lawyers to practice at the top of their license and all this, but it's fairly abstract. But I think the process you've described is a way that is a very practical way to apply that benefit of AI. Um, so one thing I like to ask all guests towards the end, and we're at nearing the end of the conversation, is just like, what makes it worthwhile for you? I mean, I think I have a hint from what we've talked about so far, but at the end of the day, doing all this stuff, and there's a lot of crazy stuff going on. I know it's a big, juggling operation, but what brings it home for you?
The big thing for me is, especially, and I've only known a lot of these people for like a month, right? But, like when it comes to my colleagues at CARPLS, the staff attorneys, the paralegals that work at CARPLS, I really want those folks to be, like working at the top of their game with like the least amount of friction possible in doing what they do and finding it fulfilling at the end of the day, right? When I was in private practice, right, like, at our firm with 4 people, even the 2 people doing the landlord tenant stuff, we were using Zapier and using a lot of stuff for automation. We were automating between 4 and 6,000 administrative tasks per week with what we were doing. What did that allow us to do? It didn't allow us to just like make money like gangbusters, right? Like we didn't just say like, oh, we'll just make more money, more money, more money. No. At 3 o'clock on Friday afternoons, we would turn on the WWE network and we would put on a classic WWE wrestling match, whether it be a SummerSlam or, whatever. We'd crack a beer and we'd kick back and enjoy life, right? That's what it afforded us that 2 hours to just hang out and chat and bond, right? That's what it gave back to us, not just squeezing every last drop of productivity out of us. So yeah, that's what I want to be able to deliver to people, is allow people to be able to, maximize their potential, but also be able to maximize their potential as, as professionals, right? To be able to explore other things in their capacity and branch out as such, and not just, answering a call every so many seconds and measuring outcomes as such. I think there's a lot more that we can do, and that's going to be the measurement of our capacity as professionals.
Well, I think that's great advice and great wisdom because, if we can live our best life and not just be, workers, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, maybe my Marxism is coming out a little bit here. Yeah, yeah, that's the way I want to. That's the way I want to see it. I just want to see people just, like if technology can play a role here to be able to do so, I want to be able to leverage it to do as much, and that's what I want to be able to get out of this, and that's what drives me, is being able to look around and deliver for people, like deliver real results, for my colleagues. And I think that just keeps paying dividends. That pays dividends for the clients that we serve, and so on. And that maintains retention for attorneys and lowers legal aid suffers considerably from from losing employees and high turnover rates. There's all sorts of stuff, and so if we can retain folks, I just think the whole system benefits from it.
Well, Conor, I want to thank you so much for spending some time with me and talking about how, AI can supercharge legal aid and the provision of legal services and lead to a better future. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me on. I've enjoyed the programming. I enjoyed hearing from Jane last week. Such a powerhouse, especially in the Illinois legal aid community and or just the Illinois legal community, and some of the other folks that you've had. So definitely a good moment for me to be on this. This is really cool.
Well, thank you. And if you could share with the audience how they can keep in touch with you, learn more about CARPLS, and maybe even support their mission.
Absolutely, absolutely. Anybody can hit me up. I'm on LinkedIn or folks at Blue Sky. I'm trying to get into a little bit more, but otherwise, C Malloy at carpels.org is always a good one if you ever want to nerd out on anything. That's a good first step. I'm pretty responsive.
And thanks again, and thanks to all of you for watching. See you next time. Thank you so much for watching the latest episode of the Lodroid Manifesto podcast. To keep in the loop about upcoming episodes, please subscribe to Lodroid Manifesto and you'll get notified. Thanks for watching. See you next time.